Good morning. It's now 9:30 and time to open the hearing session for Matter 10, which concerns economic and retail growth and the strategy for priority in rules of activity. Can I just check, Caroline, that you can see and hear me okay?
Yes, good morning, Inspector Witt, that's fine.
Morning, Caroline. Thank you. My name is Kevin Ward, and along with my colleague Phil Milam, we are the inspectors appointed by the Secretary of State under Section 20 of the Planning and Compulsory Purchase Act 2004 to carry out the independent examination of the Folkestone and Hythe District Core Strategy Review. The Programme Officer for the examination is Caroline Williams, and she'll be present for the duration of the session today. As I think Caroline will have explained, we'd prefer it if all participants could keep their cameras on during the session, but have your microphones muted until you wish to speak. If you don't wish to keep your camera on all of the time and just put it on when you speak, that's fine. Alternatively, if you just want to make contributions verbally, that's also okay. If I can just ask those participating today to introduce themselves briefly, again, just starting with the Council's representatives.
So, good morning. My name is Paul Shalarevian QC, acting for the Council.
Morning.
Morning, sir.
Good morning, sir. James Hammond, Strategy and Policy Senior Specialist on behalf of the Council.
Morning.
Good morning, Tim Bailey, Planning Policy Specialist for the Council.
Morning. Okay, and I understand we have a couple of representatives from Lichfields in support of the Council. Perhaps they could introduce themselves.
That's correct. Good morning, sir. Good morning, everybody. Kieran Jones, Senior Director at Lichfields, supporting the Council in respect of employment matters.
Morning.
Morning, Peter Wilkes from Lichfields, advising the Council on retail and town centre matters.
Morning.
Morning.
Okay, just turning to the other participants from the CPRE, we have Mr. Horner. I think if you just introduce yourself.
Morning, sir.
Yep.
Yes, Graham Horner. I am Chairman of the Shepley Area Committee of CPRE Kent.
Morning. And you're joined by Mr. Buckley, I think.
Yes, can you hear me?
I can, yes.
Paul Buckley, CPRE Kent, Senior Planner, supporting Graham Horner.
Good morning and welcome to the hearing sessions. And we have Ms. Chase, yeah.
Morning, sir. Victoria Chase from WSP on behalf of Lydd Airport.
Okay. Are you being joined today by any colleagues?
No, it's just myself today. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I think that's everyone on the list I have. Shout up if not. Again, there are obviously other representatives of the Council in the session, but taking a passive role largely unless called upon. So if necessary, we can introduce them as they come in. Thank you. Hopefully you've all got a copy of the agenda for the morning session. So as usual, we'll try to work through that in a logical order. Just to emphasise that once we've dealt with a particular item, we'll move on and we won't be returning to it. So make sure that any points that you wish to make are made at the appropriate time. As usual, I'll mainly be directing questions to the Council and those supporting the Council today, but I'll give full opportunity to the other participants to make points as we go through. As explained, I think if you do wish to speak at any point, if you can use the hand raise facility on Zoom, and I'll bring you into the discussion as soon as possible. Do not attempt to introduce new documents or share documents during the session. If we do require any further documentation, we will ask for it, and that can be provided outside of the session directly to the Programme Officer. If you are experiencing any technical difficulties or lose connection, which you can't resolve yourself, please contact the Programme Officer by alternative means, by phone or email if possible, and she'll try to assist bringing you back into the session. And if you can make sure mobile phones and other devices are on silent mode, please, for the duration of the session. We will take a break during the morning at an appropriate point. During the break, if you can turn your camera and microphone off, but make sure you're ready to come back in time for the resumption of the session. Again, I think as Caroline has explained, all of the hearing sessions are being streamed live on the Council's YouTube channel, and that can be accessed via the Council's website. So before we move on to the agenda, are there any queries or questions in terms of the format of the hearing, or indeed the use of the Zoom technology? Everyone's comfortable with that? Okay, thank you. Good. Okay, Mr. Horner, sorry.
Yes, sir, if I may, just on a point of order, over the last couple of days, a number of main matters have been discussed for bringing into the core strategy. Can I just confirm that those will be consulted on, and what will be the mechanism for that? My particular concern is there's been a lot of discussion about the level of affordable housing.
Yeah.
And we now have no particular issue with the overall figure, but there's been talk of changing figures for existing sites, and I think it's something we'd like to enlarge on when we talk about in more detail about Hospital Park.
Okay. Yeah, I think you're perhaps referring to what are called main modifications. So just to, I suppose, just to outline the process that may take place. We're examining the plan as submitted, the core strategy review document that was submitted to us. So that's the starting point of the examination. There are various outcomes from the examination, as I'm sure you appreciate, but one would be that following the hearing sessions, we would proceed to identify what we consider to be necessary main modifications, and they would be necessary in terms of soundness or legal compliance. So that's the definition of those. If there was as is normal, a process of producing main modifications, they subject to full public consultation following the hearings before we would finalise our report. So that's typically at least a 6-week public consultation period for people to comment on the main modifications. At the moment, all that's happening really is that through discussion and through the submission of statements that the council and indeed other parties have suggested to us potential main modifications, and we've discussed potential main modifications in the different hearing sessions. So, for example, the one you referred to about the affordable housing percentages has been discussed on a couple of occasions at least, but that's as far as it goes at the moment. They have been discussed, and they have been suggested, and they are potential. So we haven't made any decisions about whether we think that any modifications are necessary, or indeed what those modifications would need to be. But rest assured, ultimately, and prior to our report being finalised, there'd be full public consultation on the main modifications, whatever they may be. Yeah.
Thank you, sir. As we expected, and sorry for the confusion about the numbers.
That's fine. No, it's good to clarify these things. Thank you. So you understand the situation, that you have no further.
Yes, as I expected, actually.
Yes. Yeah. So yeah, good. Any other procedural points or queries about the format of the hearing? Okay, thank you. Good. We'll turn then to the agenda. The first item which I wanted to cover was really I suppose the evidence base for the core strategy review in terms of employment, jobs growth and employment, land employment floor space growth. So I hand over to the council. Perhaps it might be one of the representatives from Lichfields, Mr. Gunn-Jones, probably. But what I'd like to do first of all is if you can just take me through the evidence base, I suppose, as far as if we take the district-wide assessments first, that would be useful. We'll move on to the Otterpool Park specific evidence in due course, but just taking the district-wide situation as far as the evidence base for employment land requirements is concerned. Yeah. That'd be Mr. Gunn-Jones or one Mr. Bailey.
I'm going to take you through initially,
Okay.
and then if there's any points of clarification or additional information, then I think Mr. Gunn-Jones will come in and contribute.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay. So in terms of the evidence base for employment land requirements, the Employment Land Review 2017, which is document EB 0740, was prepared as part of the evidence base to inform and support the implementation of policies that was within the core strategy and the Places and Policies Local Plan. The document explores the spatial and economic context of the Folkestone Hythe district. It undertakes an analysis and critique of the existing employment space within the district and considers the office and industrial market perceptions, and performs a thorough review of employment sites existing and proposed within the district. Section 6 of the document specifically deals with calculating the future employment land space requirements for the district using methodologies that are set out within the PPG, those being labour demand, which is derived from economic forecasts using Experian data, past completions scenario, and a labour supply scenario based on population assumptions. These scenarios are explored in turn between paragraphs 6.6 and 6.36 of the document and are summarised in table 6.8 on page 56, which is titled Net Employment Space Requirements. And they are broken down and presented in terms of the core strategy period of 2006 to 2026, and then the residual requirements from 2016 to 2026, based on sort of completions data that was passed to Lichfields at the time. The net employment space requirements have then been translated into net land requirements, applying appropriate plot ratio assumptions to net floor space estimates based on the guidance on job density ratios published by Homes England. And the result of the net land requirements of the three scenarios is presented in table 6.9 on page 57. Similarly to housing, a buffer has then been applied to those net land requirements, 10% for the requirements for the whole core strategy period of 2006 to 2026, and 5% for the residual from 2016 to 2026. Finally, table 6.11 of the document converts those gross land requirements back into a gross floor space requirement. And this showed that there was residual need of between 940 square metres and 13,690 square metres gross employment floor space, depending on the scenario applied for the period 2016 to 2026. Section 7 of the document then provides an assessment of the current supply and employment floor space, looking at extant permissions, and they're set out in table 7.1, and the capacity of undeveloped allocations is set out in table 7.2. These are combined and added together and presented in table 7.3. This shows that the district at the time that the study was undertaken, had a total supply of 148,570 square metres of employment floor space. A broad comparison of the forecast requirements for employment space for the period 2016 to 2026 shows that there is sufficient supply of B-class employment space to meet the forecast need. Table 7.5 then seeks to compare demand and supply based on office and industrial space, based on the residual floor space needs outlined in table 6.11. This again demonstrates that there is sufficient and flexible supply of employment land for the period to 2026 and beyond to 2031. The council has used the land supply and the labour supply and the labour demand scenarios to base its office requirements. As there was consistency between the two figures, it wasn't deemed appropriate to use the past completions because of the significant loss of office space through the office to residential programme that was on at the time. And then we've taken the past completion scenario to plan for the requirements of our industrial floor space need. Because although the labour supply and demand scenarios showed there would be a decline, past completion showed that there actually was positive delivery within the district, and so it made sense to plan positively rather than negatively for the district. So then, in terms of the core strategy review, we commissioned Lichfields to undertake an update to that work, and that was the Otterpool Park Employment Needs Assessment, which is document EB 0720.
Okay, can I just pause you there a second? Thank you, Mr. Bailey. That's helpful. In terms of the earlier study, the 2017 study, which you've just been taking me through carefully, so I appreciate that. The time frame for that only looked up to 2026.
Yes, but the conclusions that were drawn was that there was sufficient supply to meet needs up to 2031.
Yeah, okay. But in terms of the, I know you're going to move on to the later study, but in terms of the core strategy review plan periods, the 2017 study didn't cover the whole of that plan period. Indeed, it was a much earlier base date also. That's right, yes. And then the employment needs assessment for Otterpool then builds upon that and takes us up to 2037. Yeah, okay, thank you. Yeah, carry on, thanks. Right. So the Otterpool Park Employment Needs Assessments, which is document EB 0720, seeks to provide an update to the economic growth projections and associated employment land need requirements for the district to 2037. The employment needs assessment applies the labour demand scenario. Table 2.1 of that document effectively it provides an update to table 6.2 within the ELR 2017, which shows that change of jobs forecast within the plan period reduced from 445 per annum to 237 per annum. Similarly, the forecast job growth has been converted. Sorry, can I just stop again? Just to go through this carefully. So table 2.1 refers to job change in all sectors of 4,500 over that period. So it's simply a calculation dividing that by 18 years, I presume. I think that was done by 19. Was it 19? Sorry. Yeah. Which gives the 237. Okay. Yep. So then, as with the ELR 2017, the forecast job growth has then been converted into B-class employment space, employment floor space requirements, again using the job density ratios published by Homes England, and this is shown in table
2.5 as being 16,360 square meters, up from the 13,690 that was shown in table 6.11 of the Employment Land Review. So this shows that the labour demand scenario that each of these study periods predicts that across the district, B-class uses are expected to grow, although at a slower rate than what was originally forecast in the Employment Land Review 2017.
Mm-hmm.
So then paragraphs 2.15 to 2.29, that takes us, that goes into the garden settlement.
Yeah, okay. So on the district level, I appreciate there are two different studies with different time periods, so it's perhaps not that sensible to try to compare anyway. But in terms of what might be the most comparable, looking at the four scenarios in the latest study, the Otterpool Park study, the only one that could be sensibly compared to any extent would be the first one, which was the district-wide jobs growth, which, as you say, gives a total figure of total net figure of 16,360. So that's notwithstanding the difficulties in comparing the two, but that if you were to compare, that would be the only one you could compare with the previous study in terms of the labour demand scenario.
That's my understanding, because I think the past completions scenario would have shown a loss. I think, is that right, Kieran?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you. Okay, so sticking with the district's overall situation, given the time period of the first study, is it the case that the basis for the council's approach for the district as a whole comes from the 2018, the latest study? So in terms of what you would say is a realistic assessment of employment land requirements for the district as a whole comes from that scenario, the 16,360 square meters.
That's correct, but also still planning positively for the industrial sort of floor space.
Yeah.
In addition.
Yeah. Okay. But I suppose the point really is the continued relevance, if any, of the earlier study in terms of the district-wide assessment. Have things moved on now that you are? I suppose it's there as a record of what the assessment was, but you're not basing future planning on that earlier study.
That's correct. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Thank you. Okay, so just to sum up that situation, then the study indicates a total need, and I appreciate the point about wanting to still be positive about industrial forms of development, but in overall net terms, a total need of 16,360 square meters for floor space, which when that's translated into land area, that comes out at 1.6 hectares, as I understand it.
Yes, that's how I read it as well. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So just to clarify, so as far as the council's evidence and the council's position is concerned, if you take the district-wide situation in itself, I appreciate we come on to the Otterpool situation soon, but if we take that, we have what would be called a very, very small requirement for additional employment land, 1.6 hectares.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. So if we can, again, sticking with the district-wide situation, if we can move on to the supply side of the equation, as it were, you can just take me through the information on that.
Yep. So in terms of the district-wide supply, we currently allocate through policy SS2. We've got the 8.1 of the guidance settlement, which we'll come on to, but we've also got the land that is allocated and protected through policies E1 and E2 of the places and policies local plan, and the total supply of those allocations in E1 equates to 154,000 square meters, and they have and those sites have been allocated in line with the strategic policies SS1 and SS3. So there's a good spread. There's a good spatial distribution of those sites across the district. Okay,
just so I understand fully, if it's feasible to compare, but when you say that the total 154,000 is that additional floor space? It's not existing.
That's correct. Yes, that's capacity of site allocations that have been undeveloped. Okay,
so in simple terms, is it appropriate in your view to compare that supply of 154,000 square meters with the requirement of 16,360 square meters that we've just discussed?
I mean, whilst there's 154,000 square meters there, I think we'll probably pick up on it in the Otterpool discussion. 73,000 square meters of that is allocated to a site called Link Park, which has since been acquired by Homes England, and that site will be sort of reallocated within the Otterpool boundary at a smaller scale. So there will be a reduction in that 154,000 figure. But in terms of then the overall district's position, I think is in terms of providing flexibility of employment floor space spread sort of fairly across the district, then that is a reasonable comparison.
Okay. You talked about the 73,000 square meters at Link Park. So the view is that wouldn't deliver the totality of 73, but it would still deliver a significant amount of floor space. Is there an estimate about what that would involve? So
I believe it'd be 37,000 square meters within the Otterpool Park boundary.
Okay. Okay, but I suppose even taking the totality of that 73,000 out, that there'd still, on the face of it at least, be a significant surplus.
Yes.
Of employment land compared with the requirements. Yeah, I know you were, I think, keen to move on to the point about flexibility, etc. But yeah, I'm just trying to establish I suppose the facts first of all. Yeah. Okay, so just to summarise again, total supply you've estimated of 154,000, and that's for new floor space on
that's correct
allocated sites. That could be compared with the requirement for 16,360. The 154,000 supply is likely to be reduced significantly by the Link Park situation, but we're still just roughly, we're still looking at well over 100,000 square meters of supply. Yeah. Okay. So thank you. So in terms of the implications of that on a district-wide level, again, we'll come on to the Otterpool Park situation in a moment, but in terms of the overall district situation, strategically, is it the case, as I understand it from reading the policy, that there is no there's no intention, there's no basis within the core strategy review for additional employment land allocations on a district-wide level, because the sites that already exist, the permissions that already exist, and the allocations more than adequately meet that need?
That's correct, yes, sir.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Okay. Just before I move on to look specifically at the relationship between employment and housing growth, are there any points that anyone else wishes to make in relation to the evidence about employment land requirements, or indeed the overall supply of employment land? Okay, thank you. Yeah. Okay. So yeah, just I suppose the overall question in terms of the relationship between the two, in terms of employment and housing growth across the district, bearing in mind potential implications there for commuting patterns, etc., but also I suppose the wider sustainability issues there in terms of the balance between the two. So what's the council's perspective on that?
The council is of the view that the scale and the proposed housing and employment growth across the district is balanced. The forecasts that have been set out through the employment land work that we've just discussed, they're not broken down sort of like within sub areas within the district, which means it sort of is difficult to predict where employment growth could arise within the district. And so those figures are sort of intended to be a yardstick for the scale, type and nature of employment growth, and where it could occur in the Folkestone Hythe district. As we say, as we've already sort of picked up on, the council through its site allocations have provided a broad range of sites that are spatially distributed across the district, from Folkestone through to Lydd on the Romney Marsh, and which provides opportunities, local employment opportunities across the district. So in our view, in terms of sort of commuting patterns, we sort of feel that we're providing the opportunities for local development, local working. And
so I suppose coming back to the estimates in terms of labour supply, future labour supply, how do those relate to the projections in terms of housing growth, population growth, etc.? I think that's probably what lies behind the question: is there indeed a reasonable balance? I appreciate these things are not an exact science by any stretch of the imagination, but how would you explain that there's a reasonable balance between what's expected as far as jobs growth is concerned, labour, and then the labour supply growth scenarios?
So would it be helpful if perhaps if I just assisted here, if that's helpful? Just to sort of signpost a few things. Just on the requirements point generally, just to add to what Mr. Bailey's described, I think what the council's essentially doing here through the two employment land studies that they have available, and appreciating there's a few sort of moving parts, if I can describe them, to those. But the requirements essentially, it seems to me, I think boil down to for offices, the council's essentially taking the figure of 24,750 square metres arising from the latest Experian forecast. So those are the ones set out in table 2.5 of the 2018 study. And I think in terms of industrial requirements, as Mr. Bailey described, those figures in the 2017 study were negative on a past completions basis. Sorry, on a forecast basis, but were positive on a past completions basis. And therefore, my interpretation of what the council is doing is effectively rolling forward, if you like, that previous industrial requirement, obviously now crystallised as part of the PPLP adopted this year. So effectively, if you were looking for a kind of quantitative requirement for employment land over the plan period, I think what you've got effectively is 24,750,000 of office floor space with the 15,540 square metres of industrial floor space taken from the earlier study, which gives you a figure of overall about 40,000 square metres of industrial and office needs over the plan period, if we bring those two things together. So just to say, I think the 16,000 figure scenario, only one of the figures within that scenario one in the 2018 work is relevant. That's the office figure, because essentially, as the council explained through the PPLP, for industrial requirements, they're not using the negative numbers, they're going to use the past completions based approach. So I don't know whether that just helps to explain what it's slightly comparing apples and pears, I fully appreciate, but I think that is hopefully a clarification of what Mr. Bailey was describing. Set against the requirements, set against those requirements, as you absolutely noted, we have in theory 154,000 square metres of new allocations provided for within E1 of the PPLP. As Mr. Bailey's described, because of Link Park coming out of that, if you like, from a district-wide perspective, albeit being reimagined as part of Otterpool Park, but I'll perhaps come on to that, or we will come on to that later. With Link Park excluded, the rest of the allocations provided for already through E1 are essentially about 81,000. So 81,000 of allocations against about a 40,000 square metre requirement figure gives us a surplus of about 41,000 square metres across the district. So your conclusion so early that there is a fairly significant degree of over provision of employment land is absolutely correct. That is the case. And just to, I think, add to what Mr. Bailey was describing, I think very much drawing on the conclusions set out in our 2017 work, there are a number of reasons for doing that, which the study identified. So, for example, the need to achieve new allocations for employment across a range of settlements within the district, from Folkestone through to Hythe through to Romney Marsh, the need to support regeneration aspirations in a number of those areas, and also I think the broader economic development strategy ambition that the council has to support diversification of the economy locally. So my sense will be that over provision is helping to do some of those things. So hopefully that provides just a bit of further context, I think, to what Mr. Bailey's described already. In respect of the specific question around employment and housing, now, in the 2017 Employment Land Review, we have got a labour supply-based approach set out in there, and that was drawing on the figures contained in the SHMA that was being prepared very much at the same time. And if I take you, sir, to table 6.8, which is the reference of net space requirements.
Okay, just give me 2 seconds. the right document again.
So that's table 6.8 on page 56 of document EB 07.40.
Page 56, table
6.8.
6.8, yeah.
So we have there the three scenarios: labour demand, past completions, and labour supply. And if we look at labour demand 1 and look at labour supply 3, what we can actually see is the figures, the requirements from each of those two scenarios were actually of a very similar order of magnitude. Putting aside sort of industrial, which is, of course, for reasons we've talked about, is somewhat influenced by sort of job change in industrial sectors, but not reflected in the reality of what's happened on the ground in Folkestone and Hythe. So in broad terms, that judgment, that assessment between labour demand and labour supply based on the SHMA assumptions at that time showed actually a very similar level of requirement across the two of those at least a district-wide level in that case. And that also aligns with the conclusions set out in the SHMA, which when they looked at whether there was a potential need for economic uplift or any economic uplift requirements to the housing figures, the conclusion in the SHMA Part 1 was that there was no requirement to do that. And the reason cited for that was the relatively low levels of employment growth historically that had been seen in Folkestone and Hythe or Shepway as was. So the combination of the alignment of those scenarios within the 2017 Employment Land Review, and I think the corresponding comment in the Part 1 SHMA, I think gives a good indication that actually the district-wide level, those metrics have some parity. So hopefully that helps to answer the question.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay. Is there anything you want to add to that, Mr. Bailey?
No, I've got nothing else to add to that. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. That's helpful. So, I mean, the overall situation, I think you've both fairly accepted is that in terms of supply, and I note, you know, there are different ways of coming at the supply, and there are different ways of coming at the requirement. But if you can, on any kind of basis, given the evidence that we've got, there is a supply significantly in excess of the need, of the requirements. But you make the argument that you know, that the one thing that introduces choice and flexibility, and there's I suppose a qualitative aspect to these already. I suppose the other point to note really is that the supply is what the supply is. There isn't, apart from the new garden settlement proposal, the core strategy review is not proposing additional supply. It's already there through the PPLP. So it is what it is, I suppose.
I think that's absolutely right, sir. And one then has to look at Otterpool as an entity in itself in terms of its sustainability.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Okay, Mr. Horner.
Yes, thank you, sir. A couple of points on what's been discussed so far. I'm not entirely sure where we got to in the agenda, but I hope this is relevant. I'm no expert in, and I'm afraid I'm quite good at maths. I'm rather buried with all these figures, but what I'm hearing is from top down. One point is that the employment growth has roughly halved with the two different studies that have been done, from something like 400 or so down to 200 and something. My question is, I couldn't find whether any reasons for that have been set out in the evidence base, and I suppose what goes on from that is there anything that council can do to address the reasons for that? Because clearly what we'd all like is economic growth to match this housing growth. So is there anything that can be done on the side in policy terms to perhaps encourage employers to come into the district and set up?
Okay.
Yeah, there's another point, if
Mhm.
I may, but perhaps that one could be addressed first.
Yeah. Thank you. I suppose that there are two aspects there just to respond to, if you can, from the council's perspective. First of all, what might be the reasons behind that change in job growth forecasts between the two studies? I think to some extent the council's hearing statement alludes to some factors, but perhaps you could deal with that. And I suppose secondly, and this perhaps is straying beyond necessarily the discussion about the core strategy policy itself, it perhaps gets into wider activities that the council could undertake. But in second point, so what can be done about that, and can anything be done about it, I suppose. So first of all, just what might lie behind the change in job growth forecasts?
Okay, as we set out in our response to the MIQ's question 1, paragraph 1.5, you have to the two studies. We have to treat the two different sets of economic forecasts with caution, as figures can vary between different releases. As a result, different modelling assumptions and revisions of official historical job figures. These two data sets fell either side of the EU referendum, and that potentially may have had an impact on forecast job growth with the uncertainty in terms of the markets and what the exit arrangements with the EU will be. Of course, those are still unknown. So I would say that the difference is because of obviously the uncertain economic climate that we're currently in, and the fact that these two modelling data sets fell either side of that decision.
Okay. And
yes,
Mr. Horner, yeah.
Okay, so am I to understand that even if the situation improves and the earlier estimate of job growth proves to be closer to the mark, even in that case, there is still an excess of land available for employment purposes?
I'll just say that, I mean, as Mr. Gunn-Jones has pointed out, we're looking to provide floor space requirements with, or we have floor space requirements of about 40,000 square meters. That's in excess of what the employment needs assessment was identifying, because we're still looking to plan positively in terms of the industrial floor space. So we are looking.
I'm sorry, is it the 400 or so figure that you're working from for all the 237 or whatever it's become? In other words, are you locking in this dip, which may be temporary, hopefully it's temporary, following the EU referendum, or will you be able to respond to an economic recovery in terms of supply of land?
I wouldn't say that we're locking in that figure of 237. Obviously, we have to take that figure with caution, but we have a significant surplus within our employment land supply that gives us the opportunity to respond to uplift in employment activity within the district if we return to higher levels of growth in the future.
Okay, and I suppose moving on from that, if I may, if there is this surplus, a terrific surplus, Mr. Gunn-Jones, it's of the order of 100% excess land available, it's 41,000, even after Link Park has been taken out of the picture. Is there not scope for reallocation of some of those sites for housing, given the pressure, the increasing pressures on housing? Presumably a lot of those sites are within the Folkestone urban area.
Yeah, that's something that would be considered as part of a future review of the local plan, and in light of any sort of new forecasts and floor-based requirements.
Okay, then, so if I may, Mr. Bailey has said that the distribution of employment land and the distribution of, if you like, the available workforce has not been looked at in terrific detail within the district. No particular problem with that, but the implication of these figures seems to us to be that there'll be a lot more people out commuting from the district in order to find jobs. And I think your question about the impact on patterns of commuting, the question of out commuting from the district is of perhaps more importance than the question of how people are going to get to jobs within the district. Is that something that the council could comment on?
I think I think we had a brief discussion on this on matter 4. I think my colleagues set out sort of out commuting patterns of commuting within the district. I haven't got those figures to hand right now, but I think looking at the strategy, we'll be looking at about 0.64 retainment within the district, which would show that there would be sort of no sort of net increase in out commuting from the district.
Perhaps Mr.
Yes.
While you're just checking those figures, I could just perhaps provide a bit of further guidance on a few of those points, just to pick up, Mr. Horner, what you were describing. I mean, in terms of the overall starting question around why there's change and variation in the forecasts, Mr. Bailey is absolutely correct. As we set out in para 213 of the 2018 ELNA, the 2017 study was based on the March 2016 Experian forecasts, whereas the 2018 work was based on the September 2018 forecasts. And the March 2016 forecast in the early study, of course, were the last vintage of forecasts available prior to the referendum on Britain's membership of the European Union. And it's fair to say that pretty much every forecast from every forecaster since that time has been at a somewhat lower level than forecasts preceding that, as various phases of transition and future arrangements have been established. So that's why there's variation. But of course, we would always say that caution has to be applied to forecasts of this nature. They change invariably over time. The important point is that I don't think any lower level of growth is being baked in. As is clear, the council is providing additional employment land provision for the reasons it's set out that would give sufficient headroom for either of those outcomes to be realised. On the over provision point more broadly, of course, by over providing employment land to some degree, and I think the inspector was correct earlier in saying that figure, of course, in many ways is a function of the sites and allocations made through the PPLP, and it's about distribution in different locations. And so, for example, of the 154,000 square metres provided for within policy E1 of the PPLP. About 21,000 square metres of that is located in the Romney Marsh area across 3 allocations in that location. So there is good mix across the different settlements within the district provided for within that, and that's essentially what that figure comprises. The other upshot, of course, of providing additional employment space, which in turn supports employment growth within Folkestone and Hythe as a district, of course, is that that may help to address some of these historic issues around the pace of employment growth. And of course, hopefully, with those being brought forward, will support a level of employment growth and regeneration and so forth that the council is seeking, and actually might well then provide opportunities, for example, for people who currently out-commute to Folkestone and Hythe to work locally, because those projects and sites have come forward and are generating employment. So I think it's quite a dynamic position overall, and that the council's approach of providing that additional employment space, I think, very much aligns to their objective to support the growth of the economy, which of course one would hope have a bearing on commuting patterns to some degree as well.
Understood.
Yeah. Okay. Mr. Buckley, you wish to speak. You just need to turn your microphone on.
I'm here now, thank you, sir.
Good.
I'm just coming back to the point Mr. Bailey made about the job ratio of 0.64. I mean, that is currently similar to what the district experiences, although it has obviously from no miss dropped from 0.73 in 2011. Obviously, the percentage is the same, but as labour supply grows, the number of people out commuting will increase. So unless the council's flexibility, particularly in manufacturing, allows more jobs to be created, there is the risk that more people will out commute, even though the percentage will remain the same. Thanks, sir.
Okay, thank you. I'd like to kind of move things along a bit there. We perhaps dwelled on that a bit, but I suppose just to sum up that situation, I suppose, is it fair to say the council's position is that the amount of supply is such that it provides the opportunity for, I suppose, 2 things really. One is an increase in jobs growth above that forecast, and secondly, it provides an opportunity to provide jobs for people locally, so there's an opportunity at least to impact on commuting and out commuting patterns in terms of what can be done. So perhaps that comes back to the second question Mr. Horner raised about what can be done, what will the council do. I presume that's a key aspect of the argument from the council's perspective, that amount of supply and the variety of locations for that supply is what you're doing essentially to address that situation.
Yeah, I mean, the net effect of it is that it increases choice.
Mm-hmm.
And also, given the distribution, potentially also gives rise to more sustainable locations for employment. The other thing to remember, of course, is that this is a review of the core strategy. Mm-hmm. And we have already in place the local plan with its allocations. So the key now is to make sure that the last remaining element addressed by the core strategy in terms of meeting housing need is to make sure that housing need, the additional housing which is being provided, is done so on a sustainable basis.
Okay, thank you. Good. A good moment to move forward then on to looking at the new garden settlement in terms of employment land requirements and provision. So again, I suppose just coming back to the evidence base for that. So presumably we're concentrating on the 2018 study first of all, but I'm also conscious of the employment opportunity study, which I suppose needs to be read in conjunction. But if I can ask Mr. Bailey, I presume, to take us through in terms of the evidence in relation to employment land needs provision at the new garden settlement.
Yes, certainly, sir. In terms of the garden settlement, the employment needs assessment undertakes the labour supply for 3 growth scenarios for the garden settlement in between paragraphs 2.15 and 2.29. This looks at what was the original, I think, Reg 18 policy position of 5,500 dwellings, a master plan approach design of 6,375 dwellings, and then sort of full build out of the garden settlement beyond the plan period to 10,000 dwellings. So the employment needs assessment, it looked at assuming a population growth of 2.1 residents per household, and tables 2.2, 2.3 and 2.4 of the document summarise the workplace labour supply resulting from each scenario, assuming that the majority of work age residents will take up a job in the garden community. The B class element of job growth implied by each of the scenarios has been converted into B class employment floor space figures by assuming, again, the ratio of jobs to floor space for different types of B class uses that is consistent with those applied in the employment land review. Finally, table 2.5 summarises the net employment floor space for each scenario before converting it into the net employment land requirements in table 2.6. In terms then of how the council has allocated within the core strategy the requirement for 36,760 square metres for all B class uses, its views is that sort of growth most closely aligns with the current policy position that is going to deliver 6,097 dwellings within the core strategy period to 2037.
Okay. Just we'll talk about those figures first, and then perhaps we'll come back to the relationship with the district as a whole. But so the 3, as you say, the 3 scenarios, essentially, as I understand it, based on different levels of housing growth in the new garden settlement. Just in terms of where we are with the core strategy policy, so policy SS 6, submitted version of the policy talks about a minimum of 5,925 homes in the plan period. So that doesn't exactly match any of those scenarios quite clearly.
Sorry, yes, you're correct. Sorry, I'm quoting back from the trajectory that we've submitted as part of Matter 8 in terms of the 6,097. Sorry, the policy position 5,925. But that sort of falls sort of midway between the 5,500 policy position that was the Reg 18 and the master plan approach with the 6,375, I think it is. But
if it helps me, just to add, I think in summary, the 2018 ELNA provides really in scenarios 2 and 3, sir, I think probably the ones of most direct relevance to the discussion point here, a test of what the employment land or space needs would be akin to either 5,500 or 6,375. And the council now through SS6 is anticipating 5,925 by 2037. So essentially right down the middle of those two scenarios, but I think has taken the approach of working with the slightly higher range figure that comes from the 6,375 dwelling scenario, so scenario 3. And I guess the takeaway from that is essentially the policy is effectively providing a little bit of extra employment land requirements, if you like, within Otterpool Park than might strictly be necessary. But the range essentially between the two scenarios was roughly 32,000 square meters to just shy of 37. So I think in the scheme of things that range is probably a sensible one, but it does build on that sense of a little bit of extra provision at the upper end of that range, which I think is consistent with the council's overall approach, as we've just talked about, district-wide, which is because of the need to stimulate and support employment growth. That is what they're expecting to see come forward, with the provisions also contained in the policy around early delivery of some of that, but we may pick that up later.
Yeah, I think, clearly looking at the figures, the difference between 7 hectares and 8.1 hectares in the grand scheme of things is perhaps not to be dwelled upon too much, but no, I just wanted to clarify that point really. So I suppose the logical thing from what you just said is to perhaps view scenarios 2 and 3 as providing a range, and what's actually currently proposed in the core strategy review falls within that range. And for the reasons you've explained, Mr. Gunn-Jones, that if anything, it's sensible to provide for the upper end of the range, just to give that extra flexibility. Yeah, okay, that's fine. Okay, so as far as the evidence on need is concerned, that's the basis of what's in the core strategy review. So the essentially following scenario 3. Notwithstanding the point we just discussed there about that building in a little bit of flexibility, as it were. Okay, so just to clarify how that sits with the discussion about the district-wide situation, if I bring Mr. Horner in, is it fair to say that this is additional? This is specific to the New Garden settlement? Or is it something that one could argue should be absorbed within the totality of the district provision?
Would say that this is additional and is required in order to create a sustainable garden settlement, providing job opportunities for the residents that will be residing there. And it also sort of picks up on the points of regeneration and the opportunities to diversify the economic offer of the district through the council's economic sort of growth strategy, given its location on the strategic network of the M20 and the rail network as well.
So the 2018 study, scenario 1, looks at Experian baseline job growth district wide. Does that scenario itself factor in the scale of development, including the New Garden settlement?
I think I have to revert to my colleague Kieran.
No problem at all. Yeah, so essentially the Experian scenario 1 in that is effectively akin to the Experian district-wide scenario looked at in the 2017 work. It's effectively sort of policy off, if I can describe it in those terms, and therefore it's essentially what the ambient level of need within Folkestone and Hythe would be. That needs to be set then alongside the requirements that have been identified specifically in relation to Otterpool, which is what is captured by the other scenarios set out in the 2018 study. But I think in broad terms, I'd agree with Mr. Bailey. It is additional in that sense. But I think we were very clear in both the employment opportunity study prepared for Otterpool and indeed in the 2018 ELNA that actually employment space provision at Otterpool, it can't be regarded in a silo, and ultimately, while it is about providing employment opportunities within that settlement for those residents in that location, it will also provide an additional site within the overall portfolio that Folkestone and Hythe is able to offer. It will there perform a wider employment role too, and that I think is consistent with the overall network of centres and the council's general approach that it's taken is to ensure some form of employment provision that can come forward in all of those and therefore lead to a sort of balanced distribution across the district.
Okay. So just to clarify that in terms of the baseline, I'm assuming perhaps wrongly, but the forecast, the Experian baseline forecast, will presumably look ahead and factor in what's likely to happen in terms of population growth, etc. Is that?
That's correct. Yes, absolutely. So they will incorporate a combination of the ONS population projections and also the macroeconomic forecasts at UK, regional, and then local level. So that the methodology behind that does both of those things.
So on that basis, the district-wide jobs growth forecast should presumably include the New Garden settlement on a district-wide assessment basis. I appreciate there are clearly different justifications and reasons being put forward, but in the district-wide sense, all of the growth that's expected in the core strategy review, including in the New Garden settlement, is factored into that Experian, the baseline projection.
It will take account of the baseline population projections, and it will include, for example, the current sort of commuting ratio for Folkestone and Hythe. What it won't necessarily do is deal with any adjustments to that population figure to arrive at the OAN and, if you like, the housing requirement. So, which may relate to other factors that are non-demographic, if I can describe them as that.
So yeah, I suppose, sorry to dwell on this, but in terms of the calculation of local housing need, which the core strategy review is based upon, that's clearly not simply a population or even household based calculation. It factors in the affordability factor. So I'm just trying to see the connection between the two, really. So I suppose from what you said that there is some link between the two, but it's not the entire picture. I think is that a fair assumption?
That would be a fair assessment, absolutely. So they're consistent in terms of the base demographic sort of view of the world, if I can describe it as that. But they won't. So that will be incorporated. But of course, as you've just mentioned, sir, other factors that have a bearing on ultimately what that housing requirement is will not be a function of the Experian forecast. So there's some overlap, but not entirely. If that helps clarify.
That's very helpful. Thank you. Thank you. Okay. Okay, Mr. Horney, you had your hand up. Did you want to speak, or have you?
Well, I think I've answered my own questions.
That's always good.
I was going to make a point about the distribution of sites to kind of purely office sites and, if you like, urban area sites in relation to the shift towards home working and perhaps small shared offices within the urban area. But I see the assumptions are clearly set out in 233 of the document. So it's something that we can take up perhaps in the new year in relation to.
Yeah.
Right now we know what the assumption is, then we can work from that.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Buckley.
Thanks, sir. Just a couple of points really on Otterpool Park. Looking at the EB 0720 tables 3.1 and 3.2, it implies, as I read them, that there will be fewer jobs than the expected labour supply. Now, I understand one of the aspirations of Otterpool Park is that it will be fairly self-contained. And those job ratios are somewhere around about 0.64, 0.66, depending which set of figures you use. So that does to me imply that there will be out commuting unless the council are able to do something about that. I also just question, there is the aspiration, and I don't think it is a laudable aspiration, that the people who live at Otterpool Park will have a tendency to live and work in the same place. Commendable. I'm not sure how realistic that is in reality. I live just next door to Ebbsfleet Garden City. Yes, it's closer to London, but there's a high proportion of people who will commute from there to London. And with obviously the Western Hangar station on High Speed 1, that will improve and increase accessibility elsewhere in the county and to London. So there is that potential risk that people could go to Otterpool Park and then use it as a place to live and out commute from. Following on that, there is a question of the match between housing growth and jobs provision at Otterpool Park. Will they be in sync? Because if the jobs come later on, obviously people will have made their choice as to where to go to work, and it may be harder to then persuade them to actually work back within that particular settlement area. There's a final point. So I note that that table, well, there is this, bear with me, sir. Yes, paragraph 5.1.81 of the submission plan refers to the need to ensure that the garden settlement is a truly sustainable community. Monitoring will be particularly important to ensure that population and employment are fully aligned. Now, I just wonder, sir, what the council will be able to do should monitoring show that employment lags behind population. Will there be some teeth there to actually do something about it? They're my points.
Okay, thank you. I think again, inevitably, we're straying into ground that we'll cover in more depth the session in the new year. So just I think in the interest of moving things on, I mean, I think the specifics of the new garden settlement proposal, and it's one of the key elements that we'll be raising in the session in the new year, really, is the different forms of development proposed and the interrelationship between the two. We'll be coming back to the issue about potential impacts on transport and commuting issues. So if it's so, we'll perhaps just save that for. I think I'm sure you're coming to the session from the CPRE's point of view, Mr. Horner. You're coming to the session on the new garden settlement.
I wouldn't miss it for the world, sir.
Jolly good. Yeah. So if you don't mind, we'll kind of come back to that in that more detailed session. I think we'll just try to move on in terms of the employment land assessments, I suppose. But it's a valid point, and it's noted, Mr. Buckley, and we'll certainly pick it up in more detail at later points. Okay. So in terms of the, I suppose what the core strategy review does in practical terms, then it seems to me to I suppose not that anything is simple, but it simply takes forward the assessment of the amount of employment land that's required or planned for, as it were, and builds that into the policy proposal for the new garden settlement. As I just said, we'll come back to how exactly that's going to happen and the implications of it. But the principle is that the new garden settlement will deliver that amount of employment land and jobs, etc. Yeah.
That's correct.
That's correct. Yes.
Okay, thank you. I think that's all I wanted to cover as far as the first item on the agenda, the issue of jobs growth, forecasting, etc., and overall supply. Probably moving on to a good time to take a break, and then come back to move on to retail floor space issues. So are there any further points either from the council or from other participants in relation to the employment situation itself before we move on to retail?
No, sir. Thank you.
Okay, thank
so
you.
a quick point for myself, if I may, in advance of the retail session. The examination library holds document reference EB07.10, which is the Lichfield's retail and employment, retail and leisure needs update dated December 2018.
Yeah.
Just to be fully transparent, there was a June 2019 update that sensitivity tested a different population figure to be applied, and it is fully explained in the 2019 update. I cannot see the 2019 update on the evidence library, and so it might not be before you at this time. I'd welcome clarification before the session. It's been sent across to the programme officer as a fail-safe sort of cover position for this morning, but just to alert you that we are seeking modification to policy SS7 criteria 2B that would fully align with the June 2019 update. So it is just a means of double checking that you do have the 2019 version before you.
Okay, well, I didn't, but it may well be in my inbox as we speak. So I'll check, and if I have received it, I'll yes, obviously we can refer to it. Yeah.
Apologies for that, but obviously if we're talking across two different versions, then it wouldn't make immediate sense. So
good. At least you've warned me in advance and not afterwards.
Thank you.
Okay, I'll look for that. I'm sure it will have been sent, but if not, I'll make sure it's sent and received. So, okay, Mr. Horner.
I don't see it on the web page or in my inbox. So how will we get to see that document?
Okay, Caroline, do you want to come in?
I can't hand raise, as you know, because I'm hosting the session. Impossible for me to do so. I have received the document from Mr. Toffs, and I will forward it to you. Mr. Horn, I'll also send a copy to you and Mr. Buckley, and I will update it on the library as we speak, Mr. Hammond.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Good. So just have to tend to. So we'll take a break and come back to item 2, looking at retail floor space needs, etc. So if we can resume at 11:15. Thank you. Okay, thank you. It's 11:15 and time to resume the hearing session. I think we've got everybody back. Yeah, Caroline, yep.
Just to confirm, Inspector, and for anybody else who is watching the live stream, the document is now live on the Folkestone and Hythe District website and on the examination news and updates page.
Okay, yeah, and I can confirm I've received that directly from you, Caroline, as well. Thank you for that.
Hopefully all the participants have it as well.
Yeah. Okay. So I hope you've read it fully, Mr. Horner, during the break. I'm sure it will be explained. Okay, thank you. As I said, we'll move on to retail floor space needs, etc. Again, starting with the evidence base, which I suppose brings us straight into the additional document which has just been provided. So I can turn to the council again just to explain the evidence base as far as retail floor space needs and indeed town centre uses generally is. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, sir. As set out in the Litchfield's report under both versions, the December 2018 version as well as the June 2019 version, under paragraph 1.1, the council commissioned Litchfield to undertake a partial update of the Shepperday Town Centre study dated 2015, which was prepared by Peter Brett Associates, to incorporate the emerging garden settlement development proposals at Otterpool Park. And the objectives of the town centre studies are then duly set out under the 10 listed bullet points under para 1.1. The purpose of the report prepared by Litchfields is set out under para 1.2. So as would explained, it's to provide a partial update of the 2015 study, and it provides a district-wide retail capacity projections and needs assessment to include an updated overview of retail and leisure trends under bullet 1, an update of population projections based on the Office of National Statistics latest subnational projections, adoption of experienced local expenditure data using 2016 base data for the 7 study area zones, adoption of experience latest dated December 2017 expenditure growth projections and home shopping projections, revised retail sales floor space for main food stores in the district based on ORC Store Point 2018 database, benchmark turnover estimates for existing and proposed food store floor space based on company average sales densities provided by Global Data 2018 information, experience latest forecast growth for home shopping and special forms of trading growth, an update on major pipeline developments that are likely to affect future shopping and leisure patterns, adjustments to market shares as necessary, accounting for the impact or implications of any changes that might have occurred since 2014, and analysis and recommendations on the implications of the updated need assessment and commentary on how this can be met, including the role that the new garden assessment at Otterpool Park could play in meeting this need. So in summary, the output of that work is it represents updates for sections 2, 6 and 7 of the previous 2015 study, including the quantitative capacity retail and leisure table set out in Appendix B and C. And the update will identify the scope for retail and leisure uses up to 2037 in line with the core strategy review. In terms of the 2019 update, just to make you aware of the differences, firstly, the 2018 version presented various scenarios for growth to include a baseline, but the difference between the 2018 and 2019 version relates to the average population or people per dwelling. At the time, we applied an average of 2.1 per dwelling, which is based on typical occupations across the North Downs area, which is the character area in which the proposed garden settlement sits. But Kent County Council at the time were undertaking detailed population modelling for the garden settlement, and they had sensitivity tested various assumptions and arrived at an assumed occupancy of 2.8 persons per dwelling. So as set out under paragraph 3.5 of the June 2019 version, there are 4 scenarios presented, and each of those scenarios give rise to slightly different figures that are presented in the corresponding tables within the body of that report and the associated appendices. So that is the background to the evidence.
Okay, thank you. I suppose the easiest thing to be focusing on as far as the figures are concerned would appear to be table 5.1 in both documents. Is that correct?
I believe that to be correct, sir. If I can just check and validate that point for you.
That provides seems to provide a summary of the figures in terms of floor space projections, etc.
That's something that helps. Yes, table 5.1 summarises the figures for scenario 1, which
okay.
So that is the 5,500 dwellings at Otterpool and the lower density of 2.1 people per dwelling. So that is the lowest of the.
Okay, right. Yeah. Appreciate it. Yeah. Okay. So, okay, I appreciate that. But just to clarify then, that table 5.1, noting that it does just relate to one of the now 4 scenarios looked at, that's the district, that's a total district projection, including anything at Otterpool Park, is that correct?
That's correct, sir.
Yeah. Okay, so the difference in the figures between the 2018 and the 2019 version, I suppose 2 things to clarify really. The difference in the figures is simply to do with additional scenarios being played in terms of the Otterpool Park scenario. So it's adding in the 2 scenarios where there were assumed 2.8 persons per household rather than 2.1.
That's
yeah, I'm looking at, sorry, I'm getting confused here, forgive me.
Yeah, that's partially correct. We looked at the new density scenarios, but we also updated the expenditure projections published by Experian in December of 2018. Also the deductions for special forms of trading, internet, home shopping, and updated some sales density information. Basically, it was updating anything that had been new information that had been published between the 2 reports.
Okay. But sorry, so as far as the district-wide projection is concerned, is it just based on the only figures? Is it just based on scenario 1? Forgive me, I've obviously only just seen the second document. But so taking table 5.1, that factors in scenario 1 for Otterpool Park. Are there equivalent tables looking at different scenarios on a district-wide level, or is that the only one there?
Each of the scenarios takes the global figure for the district as a whole, but includes 4 different scenarios for Otterpool Park, so that therefore the district-wide figure is higher, with more dwellings and a higher density at Otterpool Park.
Yeah. But I'm just wondering, is that illustrated anywhere? Table 5.1 illustrates the situation when you use scenario 1 on a district-wide level.
I believe, sir, that there is a breakdown into corresponding zones as well. Is that correct, Mr. Wilkes?
Yes.
We're just looking for the table references.
Yeah, I mean, tables 3.4 to 3.7 give you the different figures for each scenario for Otterpool Park.
Yeah.
The full scenarios are contained within the appendices. So, for example, Appendix 2 sets out the capacity for convenience food and grocery shopping, and you will see in tables 11A to 11B, 11C and 11D sets out the capacity for all 4 scenarios just for convenience shopping. And then if you go to Appendix 3, the full 4 scenarios are shown in tables 10A to 10D. And then finally in Appendix 4, the food and beverage, that's the class A3 and A5 in before decimalisation, is 11A to 11D. So we haven't included all the tables in the main text, and clearly there'd be a large number of tables, so we just provided the scenario 1 as a summary in the text. But if you want to look at the full detail, I would suggest go to those relevant appendices. Okay.
So for the 4, I understand, thank you. The 4 scenarios, you've chosen to highlight scenario 1, perhaps for good reason, and other scenarios are shown in detail in the appendices. But so just to clarify, the difference between it's the Otterpool Park different scenarios which create the difference. Noting what you said about updating the broad information on expenditure, etc., but the key difference there is between those different scenarios. So in terms of the 4 different scenarios, does the latest study reach a conclusion about which is the most appropriate scenario of those 4 to follow, or does it simply just present them as options, as it were?
I think we produced it as presenting options to the council to then take away and obviously discuss with the developers of Otterpool which is the most appropriate scenarios to adopt.
Yeah. Okay.
And then taking that one step further for its incorporation into the core strategy review, under policy SS7, the council had evidence from the promoter in respect to a master plan to give confidence that scenario 4 could be applied. And so the figures that will appear within a modification to policy SS7 criteria 2B duly apply those figures from scenario 4. But we present the floor space values as up to figures as opposed to, for example, approximately, because we're aware that the scenarios that were tested provide a range of numbers, and so we felt it appropriate to put them in the context of up to a specified floor space amount.
Okay. Well, come on. From what you've said, I don't think we've seen it yet, but you appear to be suggesting the council are putting forward proposed modification to policy SS7.
So yes,
yeah.
It appeared under the guise of a modification that forms part of the statement of common ground between the District Council and Ashford Borough Council, and is set out within the enclosed information to our response to the inspector's letter dated May 2020.
Thank you. Okay. So the rationale for that, from your council's perspective, there's the different scenario based on 2.8, an assumption of 2.8 people per household. I appreciate what you just said about an up to figure. So in effect, it's still still looking at a range in that sense, but it's based on the premise of a 2.8 person per household, and also information fed in from the master planning exercise. Is that a fair summary?
That's correct, sir. We wanted the assumptions to reflect other detailed demographic modelling undertaken by various parties, not only the county council but other infrastructure providers, and so it seemed wholly appropriate to also run with that same value. And as already explained, the master plan gave confidence that the up to figure could be achieved.
Okay. Okay, thank you. So coming back to the district-wide situation, first of all, the basis for, if we take policy SS2, that refers to, excuse me, that refers to approximately 31,205 square meters gross of retail. Can you just explain where that figure came from, please?
Yes, thank you, sir. The District Council, in light of the proposed modification to policy SS7 criteria 2B, as a means of double checking our entries, we're just seeking to clarify the point in terms of table 4.2, but the approximate figures of 31,205 square meters gross, comprising 4,620 square meters of convenience goods floor space and 26,585 square meters comparison goods floor space, would have been articulated within the Litchfield study. But as a means of check and balance, sir, we would welcome the opportunity to cast a further eye over the figures to make sure that table 4.2 is accurately and correctly reflected. Okay,
that would be helpful. I mean, I'm just looking at the 2018 the 2018 study, table 5.1 again in that version, which seems to give a figure of 32,993.
Yes, if I can explain, the figures in table 4.1 in the plan refer to the high growth scenario in the 2018 report, but they only include convenience and comparison goods floor space. They don't include the A3 to A5 food and beverage projection. So the table 5.1, the 32,993 you're referring to, is the baseline scenario and including the A3 to A5. So that those two figures are not directly comparable.
So can you point me, you talked about the high growth scenario, just give me a reference for that.
So yes, the high growth scenario. So if we were to reproduce table 5.1 with the higher growth scenarios, the figures should be for 2037, the overall total would be 35,794, made up of 4,620 for convenience goods, 26,585 square meters for comparison, and 4,589 square meters for food and beverage.
Okay, can you just point me to where in that report those figures are set out?
Those figures would be in the appendices. So appendix 2, if we go down to table, sorry. Yeah, so table 12B, you will see the 4,620 figure for convenience goods.
Mhm.
And then if we go to the next appendix with comparison goods, it is in the 26,585 is in table 10B. So that's in appendix 3, and then appendix 4, the food and beverage. If we go to table 11B is the 4,589 figure.
Sorry, table
11B in appendix 4.
Splitting hairs really, but can you just remind me that why? So that's 4589, but the figure in the policy is 4620. It is splitting hairs. I appreciate that, but
The 4620 is convenience A1 food and grocery floor space, whereas the food and beverage is the class A3 to A5 restaurants, cafes, bars figures. So they're two separate figures.
okay. Right. Okay. Yeah. Thank you.
Point of clarification, if I may, please, sir.
Yep.
So under policy SS7 criteria 2B, we're obviously, the district council is putting forward an argument that we are convinced that it is appropriate to run with scenario 4. My reading of policy SS2 under the figures that we have just discussed is that it should also be duly appropriate to apply the figures of scenario 4 from the June 2019 update report within that table. And so that's why we would welcome the opportunity to have another count up to and a discussion with colleagues from Lichfields to make sense of table 4.2 that sits under policy SS2. If we can maybe provide you with a supplementary note to that effect.
Okay. I think I understand. Yes, it's getting quite complicated.
Otherwise we're running with two scenarios, aren't we? We're running with the
Yeah.
assumption of scenario 4 from the 2019 report versus scenario 1 from the 2018 version.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
just a case of getting our stall in order.
And so presumably scenario 4 would give greater figures on the district level as well, obviously.
We'll go away and check. That's my inference. But if we do a tally up of the numbers, then we can give you that true and proper information with also the appended references from the Lichfields work.
Yes, the global capacity figure for convenience, comparison and food and beverage, the high growth scenario in the 2018 report was 35,794.
Mm-hmm.
In the latest, the 2019 report, the high growth scenario 4 gives a global figure, a very similar global figure of 35,717.
Mm-hmm.
So in a way, the sort of sensitivity analysis we undertook from 2018 to 19 gave us confidence that the figures are in the right ballpark.
Okay, I think all we can do there is just give the council the opportunity to rethink those figures and come back. I think in addition to suggesting alternative figures, it would be useful just to provide a note just to explain what those figures are based on. But a question, I suppose, here, I mean, just going back to the discussion we had earlier on employment land, which from my recollection seemed to be based on an assumption of 2.1 persons per household. Is that correct? Would there be a discrepancy then in terms of projections as far as employment growth is concerned and retail growth?
but if we can please just have a couple of minutes to discuss that matter, come back to you.
Okay, yeah, if we can keep going, but if you can, whoever needs to can have a discussion behind the scenes, as it were. I'd like to move on. Yeah. Okay, so I suppose, yeah, I mean, we'll leave that particular aspect of it there, really. I mean, if it's the council's position, which I understand it to be, that you would consider it more appropriate to use those more up-to-date assessments, and therefore there'd be an impact on both policy SS2 and policy SS7 as far as the figures are concerned. I'll leave it with you to think about the figures.
Yeah, we'll look at the ratios and see if there is actually anything in that we need to bring to your attention.
Yeah.
And when we review these figures, to make sure everything's in order. So we'll provide you with a short note to that effect.
Okay. I mean, the other, as well as the difference perhaps in terms of the assumption about number of people per household, or per dwelling rather, there is the issue which we come back to, where the scenarios, the number of dwellings in each scenario tested, it doesn't exactly fit with what's actually proposed in the core strategy review. So, for example, the higher scenario talks about 6375, doesn't it? I think. So yeah, I mean, I'm not sure we're going to get immensely far in the course of a verbal discussion on it, but if you could just give some thought to that aspect of it as well, that the relationship between calculating what the retail floor space needs would be, and how that ties with the figures that are actually in policy, the policies relating to the new garden settlement.
Okay, we'll do that, certainly.
Yeah. Okay. Mr. Buckley.
Thanks, sir. Obviously, these figures have been, for good reason, we've only just received them. There are figures there regarding Otterpool Park and retail provision there.
Yeah.
Will that be the subject of the discussion on Otterpool Park at the beginning of January?
Yes, it was our intention. We're hoping to publish the agenda for that session very soon, and it's certainly the intention, I think, to cover. I mean, we may well, I'm sure we will be coming back to this analysis specifically in relation to the new garden settlement. But yes, one aspect of the proposal we want to look at is the different forms of development proposed and the justification for that and the scale of that development proposed. So yes, inevitably we'll be coming back, not least because we'll need to discuss with other parties the proposed modifications to policy SS7 in any case. So yes, we'll come back to that, no doubt. It might, that might be another benefit of the council producing the information and perhaps an explanatory note on it, which perhaps will help to inform people. But the amended document is now been put on the website, and we'll make sure people's attention is drawn to that before the session. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. Okay. I think we'll leave the figures there, I suppose. I understand, I think, and I'll give more thought to that in terms of the background to the figures. Thank you for the explanation of the update. That was helpful. But yeah, I think if you can come back to us, probably, ideally, I appreciate there's not much time, but ideally before the session on the new garden settlement with some revised suggested figures and a note explaining where it's coming from, etc. That would be helpful. Okay, so moving on to how that, whatever those need figures turn out to be, how those need figures will be met, the intention. So again, if we can take the district-wide situation as far as making or doing as much as possible to make sure that those that need that's been identified can actually be met or is already being met in the district. Yep.
Yes, thank you, sir. The strategic implications for the district in regards to retail and leisure is duly set out under under a section headed strategic implications, beginning paragraph 5.6 of the Lichfield's 2019 update report. So it explains that the existing stock of premises will have a role to play in accommodating projected growth, and the capacity analysis assumes that existing retail floor space can, on average, increase its turnover to sales floor space densities, in addition to the growth in sales densities and vacant shops could help accommodate future growth. However, there is limited scope for this level of floor space to be accommodated within the existing stock, as noted by the 2015 study. As a strategic approach, retail and leisure growth should be focused in the main town centres, where there are the best prospects for attracting investment, and this is consistent with the approach set out in the existing development plan, so the core strategy and the MPPF. As previously indicated in the 2015 study, the sites with the greatest potential for redevelopment are Folkestone bus station, which is centrally located within Folkestone town, and the existing retail units on Guildhall Street, Gloucester Place and Shelland Street. Long-term scope also exists for the redevelopment of the Sainsbury's store and adjacent areas at Bouverie Place West. The bus station site provides the opportunity for a retail leisure-led development that could include new retail units, restaurants, bars and a cinema, subject to market demand, and this could help enhance the leisure offer in the district, as residents currently look to towns outside of the district to meet their leisure needs. Guildhall Street, Gloucester Place and Shelland Street could be redeveloped, the report notes, to provide larger footprint modern shop units, and this will allow larger retailers to occupy space in the town centre through the provision of better quality larger shop units. Other floor space requirements could be accommodated through commitments or planning permissions approved since 2015. For example, the redevelopment of land at Shorncliffe Garrison at the stadium includes the provision of retail and cafe/restaurant floor space. Excuse me. As previously indicated in the 2015 study, for all other smaller centres in the district, the significant additional amount of new retail or commercial leisure would not be expected to come forward. This is more likely to be small infill development, shop extensions and expansion into upper floors. Notwithstanding this, the development plan should be flexible enough to allow applications for new development, which will enhance vitality and viability of the centre, to come forward. In addition to that, it's pertinent to note that the District Council has commissioned work on a Folkestone Town Centre study. This is supplementary to the Lichfield's work. So the District Council is taking a leading role in that exercise. That involves a number of professional consultancies that have been appointed to provide commercial advice in terms of where there could be opportunities to repurpose and reimagine parts of the town centre in Folkestone. And the District Council has also taken an ownership interest in certain parts of Folkestone Town Centre. So in many ways, part of that strategy is already beginning to have a genesis of its own. And then the strategic, from a strategic emphasis, the remaining delivery would come from multiple parks.
Okay, thank you. So notwithstanding, excuse me, notwithstanding the discussion about the figures that are set out in Policy SS2, in terms of the question of how that will be provided for, the putting the new garden settlement to one side for a moment, but the core strategy review doesn't actively seek to allocate any new sites for retail floor space, but there are, I'm just looking at the council's hearing statement, so clearly the Folkestone Seafront proposal, which we discussed the other day, the intention there that would include significant amounts of broadly commercial floor space, which could could address some of the need, etc. And you've given some examples. But the policies, Places and Policies local plan, does that have specific allocations in it which would achieve some retail floor space?
Excuse me, sir. I'll just confer with a colleague.
Yep.
So if I just pick up on that point, the Places and Policies local plan doesn't make any, say, specific retail only allocations. There are some sort of smaller retail allocations as part of like mixed use development sites. And I think sort of the key example of that is policy RL10, which was set out in the hearing statement, which forms part of the redevelopment of the former Silver Spring site at Park Farm for 3,500 square meters of A1 floor space.
Okay. So I suppose pulling all that together, the council's position is that the needs for additional retail floor space that have been identified can be readily met in terms of existing commitments and some allocations, at least for mixed use development. There's not a shortfall in the sense of supply.
Not in our view, no.
Okay. Thank you. Okay. That's all I have in terms of the retail issue. If there's anything the council wishes to come back on that we've gone through so far.
No, thank you, sir.
Okay, Mr. Horner or Mr. Buckley, is any further points on the retail issue before we move on to look more specifically at policy SS4? No.
No, sir.
Okay, thank you. Okay, policy SS4 and indeed table 4.5. Yeah, so I guess if we take the overview really and look at the concept of the priority centres of activity and the network of them, I had noticed, and I noticed a while ago, and forgive me, I didn't raise this with the council. I noticed again yesterday when I was revisiting my preparation that the council's hearing statement, unless I've missed it, didn't answer one specific question. I'm hoping it's a fairly straightforward question to answer verbally. It might be helpful to supplement that with a note. But question 9, which was set out, I'm just to remind myself what question 9 actually said. Yeah, what's the basis for the network of the priority centres of activity? Are they appropriately defined, and is the hierarchy justified? So just wanted, perhaps just if you can pick that up first of all verbally, and then I think it probably would be helpful, unless I've missed something and the answer's embedded under another answer. I'm not sure.
No, we did miss it. We did miss it. Correct.
Okay, thank you.
Just 2 seconds. So the basis for the for policy SS4 priority centres of activity is born out of the strategic need, or in response to strategic need A of the core strategy, which looks to address that sort of challenges and to improve employment, educational attainment and economic performance. What it seeks to do there is identify focal points for maintaining and developing jobs and services within the district in order to contribute to the continued vitality and viability of those sites. They are identified as sort of being sort of, as I say, focal points that consist of significant employment sites, say industrial sites or business parks, but also high streets, local centres, anywhere where there's a concentration of economic activity.
Mm-hmm.
And by focusing development on those priority centres, we look to be able to focus investment and regeneration opportunities in those areas, as I say, to be able to sort of maintain their contribution as economic assets to the district. The hierarchy, the major employment sites, they have been identified as the key industrial and office-based sites across the district. And then in terms of retail, we've got the town centres, district centres and local centres, and that's based on sort of the structure hierarchy in the 2015 retail study. In terms of applying the settlements or the service areas within that table, that sort of draws through from policy SS3 and the sustainable settlements strategy, because it's a blend of employment and retail. Though officers have sort of taken a judgment as to where those settlements sort of best sit within that hierarchy.
So in terms of the town centre, district centre, local centre categories, that, as I understand, that's based on analysis undertaken from the 2015 study. Has there been any update of that as far as monitoring, etc.? So I'm presuming it was largely based on assessment of land uses on the ground, as it were.
Yeah, that's correct. Yes.
And is that something that's subject to monitoring and review over time?
We do monitor as part of our authority monitoring reports. We monitor the uses within the ground floor of those service areas and those high street areas, and report on sort of the vacancies and the vitality and viability of those centres. Yeah.
And in terms of the definition, they are shown on the policies map. So, for example, in terms of the town centre boundary, district centre boundaries.
Yes, they're shown on the policies map.
And there's nothing that's led you to revisit those boundaries in terms of any significant change over the recent years?
No, there's nothing that's drawn our attention.
Okay. And in terms of the major employment sites, as you described them, they're kind of the focal points for industrial or office based development. was there a particular kind of threshold that you might have applied? Obviously, the term major suggests that you've looked at more significant areas. Was there a particular threshold in terms of the size of the area or the site that you were concerned with?
No, there wasn't a threshold as such applied. It was just looking at existing employment sites where there was a concentration or a cluster of businesses grouped together.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Okay, thank you. Before I move on to look at the policy criteria, etc., I'll just give Ms. Chase the opportunity. I know you're here representing the London Ashford Airport, and you'd raise representations in relation to policy SS4 and indeed the definition of the priority centres network. I'm conscious that my colleague has had hearings where there's been some discussion about the airport and potential modifications involved there, but is there anything you wanted to add as far as this debate is concerned, Ms. Chase?
Thank you, sir. Not for this, no. I think we were quite satisfied with the conversations that have been happening with the council on the policy wording for SS1. So nothing on this one for now. Thank you.
Okay, but your representations were seeking specific recognition of the airport in terms of I think along the lines of it being a major employment location reflected in the priority centres network.
Yeah, so originally we did want something in the policies to reflect Lydd Airport, as we felt that the document itself didn't represent Lydd Airport whatsoever. So we wanted to make representations on certain policies where we felt Lydd could be mentioned. However, given the fact that we've agreed wording on the SS1 to include the area action plan, we feel that Lydd Airport has been represented within the local plan policies, and we don't feel the core strategy review policies, and we don't feel that we need to press the matter any further on the other policies.
Okay. Okay, thank you. Good. Okay, I'll unless there are any other more general points about the priority centres of activity, just move on to the specifics of policy SS4. So if we take the approach to retail development first of all, I suppose just to ask the council to outline what the approach is intended to be and how you see that being justified, and particularly in terms of consistency with national policy. So retail policy first of all. Yeah.
Okay. Yes. So in terms of retail policy, SS4 seeks to adopt the town centre first approach in align with national policy, and that looks to focus investment and development to the town centre first, then looking to edge event centre sites, and then only after that, if there are no opportunities available, to look outside of the town centre boundaries, and also to have due regard to their impact on the vitality and viability of any development outside of the defined districts and local centres, and that, in the council view, is in complete accordance with the MPPF paragraph 86 and 87.
And as far as the PPLP is concerned, there are more detailed policies relating to retail or town centre use development.
That's correct, sir. We have policies RL2 for Folkestone through to policies RL8 for any other development outside of the district and local centres, and which also incorporates an impact testing threshold for development outside of the town and district centres, and that was in line with the recommendations of the town centre study 2015 that was done by Peter Bretz.
So policy SS4 in retail policy terms is clearly intended to be a more strategic level principal policy, really, which in effect is supplemented by the PPLP.
That's correct, yes, sir.
Okay, thank you. Okay, move on. The approach in the policy to employment developments, again, just a quick outline of the approach that there is and the justification for it.
Okay, out of the employment land reviews that have been done for the council over the years, 2011, and then that was updated in 2017, that picks up that much of the local authorities' employment space that is existing is of poor quality, has poor access, but has a high level of occupation with low levels of vacancy, and those areas are coming under increasing pressure from competing high value land uses. So what this part of the policy was seeking to do was to try and deliver sort of commercial regeneration objectives of those sites by giving opportunities for other uses alongside new B-class uses on those sites.
Okay. Thank you. So just a specific point in relation to Part B of the policy and the second bullet point. So it begins where demonstrated to be in locations suffering long-standing deprivation. I just wondered if you could explain the rationale and justification for that particular policy approach, please.
I think it goes back to the strategic aims and objectives that was set out at the beginning of the core strategy, looking to address areas of deprivation within the district, and by looking to encourage investment to encourage investment to those areas, to increase prosperity within those areas with job opportunities, high wages, and so forth.
Okay, but just looking at the way the policy is phrased, Part B of the policy refers to etc. Development for employment generating uses will only be acceptable, and then there are two bullet points which follow. The first relates to policy SS1 3 CSD 3. The second one talks about where demonstrated to be in locations suffering long-standing deprivation, etc. So it reads as a specific policy requirement that in those cases that would have to be satisfied. It goes beyond an encouragement, I suppose, of certain things. Do you accept that?
Oh no.
Sorry, I lost my screen. Yeah, it does impose. Qualitative requirements in terms of satisfying that criteria.
Mm-hmm.
That's what it does.
Is that a reasonable thing for it to do?
Well, insofar as we're looking at employment proposals beyond the areas identified, and in accordance with SS1-3 and CSD3. I suppose the question remains whether or not it's appropriate that employment should take place outside those existing areas, for which I don't have an answer, to be honest with you. It's a good question. One could liberalize it in terms of rephrasing it so as to refer to opportunities, and import a degree of flexibility in that sense into the policy.
Yeah, it's just reading the policy through. There's a series of steps to be taken, and as you say, the focus is intended to be on the major employment sites, and then it goes on to talk about if sites are unavailable or unfeasible within any priority centre of activity, and that broadens out the range. It
does, yeah.
But then it still does allow, in principle, it seems to me, once you've satisfied those tests and you've gone through those options, it does in principle seem to allow for employment generating uses. And if you take SS1, SS3 and CSD3, in effect, that's steering employment development to settlements or specific circumstances.
That's right. Yeah.
Which is, I think, a reasonable policy position. It's just the second bullet point, really, which I think takes it into having satisfied all of those criteria, unless you can demonstrate you're in an area suffering long-standing deprivation, it would appear to rule it out. So I'm just wondering.
Well, it does.
Yeah.
It does rule it out.
Okay. I mean, that's okay. I think
if on consideration you think that is not a sound approach, it could be reworded so as to, as it were, supplement rather than require those criteria to be met. So in other words, you could add words, and particularly where, or especially where it can be demonstrated that. So it's not a requirement in its own own right. It's something which is supplementary to the first bullet point.
Yeah. Okay. I think you get the point on that.
I do get the point.
Probably one of those where if we give the council the opportunity to have a think about how that might be expressed. I mean, it seems to me to be a laudable aim, as it were, and a justifiable aim in that sense. But whether it can be an explicit requirement is a different matter. So.
I think the problem is if it's made a specific requirement, it has to be evidence-based. So then you require some information about these areas and what you intend for them. And that's why I think it ought to be more permissive than it appears.
Yeah. Okay. I'll leave that with you to have a look at then. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Can we have it read?
Okay. Right. So I'll look at the wording in any event pending your decision on that.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Horner.
Yes. So just briefly, I'm just wondering how this. I live in Stanford, which is a small village. It has a pub and nothing else in terms of facilities. Pub and a church.
What more can you need?
I beg your pardon?
What more can you want? A pub and a church. Very lucky.
Well, yeah, indeed. Well, I was going to say, suppose somebody proposed to set up a shop in the village. I think it would be welcome to the villagers, but it probably wouldn't meet any of those criteria in that clause. So I'm just wondering how that would affect the on the ground.
It's no. Part B relates to other employment generating non-town centre activities.
Yes. Is that not that doesn't include retail? And is that what you're saying?
Yeah, it specifically talks about non-town other employment uses non-town centre. So town centre use is a broad term which includes retail use, even if it's not in a town centre, as it were. Even well, it used to under the old use classes order. I'm not quite sure what it means these days, but there we go. I suppose in any case, just looking at policy CSD3, rural and tourism development, that has a specific clause in it which relates to local public or essential services. So there's perhaps another route in any case there. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Okay, I think that really just brings me to the final 2 points on the agenda. Just first of all, to again look at the use classes order and the changes to that. So I note from the council's hearing statement that you were suggesting that the final paragraph of the policy could be removed for other reasons, perhaps, but that happens to be the paragraph that makes specific reference to use classes which no longer exist.
We've got, actually, there's more than that. I've reviewed the policy again.
Okay.
And to deal with the stoat in the coop, so to speak, of the new use class changes, we've got to be careful about how we express ourselves here, having regard to the objectives of the policy. So references to A and B class uses needs to be revised. And in relation to B class uses, we need to be clear about what we mean. And so that would need to comprise and be set out as comprising office, B2, B8, light industrial, research and development.
Okay.
And that has to be repeated throughout the whole document, frankly. To make sure that the qualitative controls we're looking for in policy terms are there. I mean, obviously the policy can't help what is not development taking place. It can't prevent that in due course. But in terms of identifying development and development opportunities, then we have to be specific about what it is we're looking to see in order to meet the job requirement.
Yeah, okay.
And that apply also in relation to A-class uses too.
Yeah.
So I'll certainly review the policy in advance of your consideration or your decision in relation to modifications, so that you have it before you can look at it.
But you acknowledge that in principle that it needs to be modified.
Without question, without question.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. That's helpful. Okay. Apart from the use class issue, any other modifications that the council have come across or would suggest? No.
Sorry, just one other I've identified, but I've not discussed it with anyone instructing me. But so I don't think they'll shoot me down in flames. And it's a typical barrister's point. But before the last two bullet points, there's a paragraph beginning to deliver commercial regeneration objectives. Mixed-use development on employment land may be acceptable in line with the above principles where appropriate new B-class premises are provided. I think it should say included, but that's a small point.
Okay.
All right.
Yeah, I mean, in looking at the policy as a whole, as far as potential modifications in terms of use class order, if other things come to light and make suggestions, we'll take those on board as well.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. That's everything I had to cover. Just an opportunity, Mr. Horn and Mr. Buckley, Ms. Chase, if there's any final points you haven't made and you wish to make before we close.
No, sir.
No. Okay. Anything?
Not from me. Not from me. Thank you.
Okay.
No, sir, not from me.
Anything final from the council on this matter?
Yeah.
Yes, there's one thing. I don't know if you're going to come back to SS2.
Yeah, can do.
It's the same point there. If one's looking at SS2, we need to be careful also about what we are talking about in terms of actual employment uses.
Yeah.
And it's important, therefore, to, I think, change the table, the descriptions in the table in the way in which I've already described.
Yeah.
And at the top of the first column, it says use. Now, I want to get away from this idea that we're talking about uses. We're talking about development. And so that should be headed development type. So that where it says employment uses, it should say employment : office, light industrial, research and development, B2, B8.
Yeah. So
that you know exactly what the policy is directed at.
Yeah. Okay.
What happens after that? Who knows?
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Thank you. Okay. Nothing else to add?
And also, sir, we discussed, sorry if I may, we discussed the tallying up of numbers earlier in the session. And so table 4.2 may need to include some reflection on the entries in terms of square metre gross floor space, but that will be drawn out within the update note.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, we're just on a broader point. We've looked at the list of action points, so we should be able to provide a list of action points arising from this first week of hearings. So what's become apparent, I think, in terms of particular policies, there may well have been a number of different discussions and suggestions about potential modifications. So probably to keep it as simple as possible, intention probably be to wrap up that action into a single one, really, which is to effectively have another look at the policy in its totality and pick up a number of issues, but rather than having several suggestions for modifications individually, essentially a comprehensive look at the policy and coming up with some modifications that the council can suggest to us will be probably more useful. So yeah, the intention is we'll get a list of actions from this week sent to the council, hopefully later today, and then
we'll check it off against our own list as well, just to see, make sure that nothing's forgotten, so to speak.
Yeah, indeed, that's helpful. Okay. I think for the most part, it's going to be things that can be provided, over the course of the next few weeks. Some of the things were more urgent, and I think they've been provided already. But the only thing I would again take the opportunity to emphasise is the work with Highways England in terms of the potential statement of common ground. So just an extra nudge in that direction from my point of view.
No, that's understood.
Yeah. Okay, good. Okay, so that concludes the session for today. So just thank everybody again for their participation. So that brings the first week of hearings to a close, and we'll return again in the new year. So just on behalf of Mr. Milam and myself, just to thank everybody for their participation so far. Wish you all a good break over the Christmas period and a safe and peaceful time. And if you're able to get any enjoyment out of it under current circumstances, then hopefully you will. So thank you all again, and we'll see you, or most of you at least, in the new year. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Merry Christmas.
Okay, take care.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir, to you. Thank you.